Let me just start by saying I know the title of this video is very clickbaity and cliched. There's so many 5 tips that people claim can improve your videos, that can improve your photos, and I understand that, and I don't want to come across as I'm doing this just to try and get clickbait or get clicks onto my video. I do think that these can help you improve your photography. They've helped me improve my photography in the past, and I think that if you just hear me out, by the end of it you might have some inspiration to try something different. And I must say that YouTube is famous for this, so when in Rome, do as the Romans do. So I'm just going to do my own take on it. I know that some of you are already switching off, and that's fine too. Before we continue, I just want to shout out to all the people that have been watching and commenting on my videos. It's been really appreciated, and I just want to say thank you very much for continuing to support my work, and I hope you enjoy what's coming up. Now, these 5 tips, they're not what you're going to be expecting, I think, in a lot of ways. And I must admit, they're not going to make you a photography god. That's just impossible. No tip video on YouTube will ever make you a photography god. That's just false marketing to get you onto their websites and onto their courses and stuff like that. So these are just 5 genuine ideas that I think can really help you improve your photos. These are 5 things that I wish I knew several years ago when I was really stuck and not improving my photography and always wondering why I wasn't doing as well as I thought I should be. And so over the past few years, I've learned these 5 things, and some of them are experiments, some of them are just different ideas that you might not have thought about or heard of before. Please bear with me, and I hope you are inspired to try some of these out for yourself. I started photography thanks to a course in my secondary school that was all dedicated to film photography. We had a darkroom on site, and we had all of this wonderful equipment to be able to process our own film and create and print our own images, and it was an amazing course. And through it, my love for photography developed. I know, a terrible pun, but it really did develop with the program. And I've mentioned before that I would like to get back to film photography at some point when I have a bit more space and I have a bit more equipment available. But anyway, when my course at school finished, I begged my family to let me use a digital SLR that my mum had and that she wasn't using too much. And after a lot of persuasion and a lot of prodding, eventually my mum agreed, and I was able to use this wonderful digital camera to go out and practice photography. I didn't understand digital photography at the time. I would only shoot in JPEG, and I was just experimenting and having fun with actually just taking pictures. That was what I was interested in. I didn't have that much control with the film. It's a lot simpler style of photography. You have to make the decision on film beforehand. You can only really change the aperture and the shutter speed, and it's all about the subject itself. So that's sort of what I went into digital doing as well. I didn't care about all the editing and everything else, and if you've watched my videos, you know that I don't do a lot of editing. I try and keep it very natural looking because of that background in film photography. I don't like to have 5 billion Photoshop layers that are all compressed down into one final image. Adding in and taking away a lot of stuff is just too much for me. Through that film education, I sort of learned to create images without the thought process that I can correct it later. I had to be very focused on what I was producing in camera, because otherwise my images would just turn out terrible when printed. So I just had to really focus in on what I was able to do with the camera. So when I was using my first digital camera and I was shooting in JPEG, I had that mentality, but there was a lot of images that failed because of that. And so this isn't even included in my 5 tips, but I would always recommend that you shoot in RAW. I know it's been done a million times, it's been said by everyone, and I really do believe that. However, my first tip Tip number 1 is to shoot in JPEG. I know it's completely opposite to what I just said about shooting in RAW, but there is some valid reasons for why you might want to shoot in JPEG and why I recommend you to try shooting in JPEG just on occasion or during some experiments. Basically, I want you to experiment with JPEG as a tip to improve your photography. The reason is, in JPEGs, all of that information is embedded down, just like in film. You have to really concentrate on your camera settings to be able to get a usable image. Because if you try doing as much editing as you would with a raw image, you will just degrade the image and it will not be useful for anything. So to really keep the quality of the JPEG, you need to be very focused on your settings. And in particular, the two settings that are most important with a JPEG that you can adjust later in RAW is white balance and picture style. So white balance refers to the color temperature of the picture, and it's usually on a scale of blue to orange. This is just very broad generalization. When shooting in RAW, you don't have to care about white balance. I often set it when I'm editing my RAW images by selecting an area that I want to appear neutral, and then I adjust it if I want it to feel a bit more warm or cool based on the climatic conditions of that day. But obviously with a JPEG, that is not possible. You just can't adjust the temperature of an image later on because it will look terrible. It will change the color balance of all of the colors. And that's one of the settings that you should be focusing on in camera. It can give you a lot of information about how to read the light of a scene to render the colors in a more natural way. The second setting is picture style. And this setting has a lot of different settings attached to it. When you import a RAW file from your camera onto the computer, it obliterates the picture style completely. And that means your RAW files look very flat and unappealing, and that's when we start dialing in contrast, sharpening the pictures and everything else to get them to look a bit crisper and a bit nicer. Your picture style in camera handles those settings. It handles sharpness, contrast, picture tone, and what was the fourth one? Saturation. So those 4 settings are handled by your picture style, and each camera comes with a preloaded preset, a set of presets, and you can choose those based on what you want your JPEG to look like. And there's even a user-defined one where you can adjust those settings to create your own style of imagery. Now, the combination of white balance and picture style can really give your images a certain look, a certain style to them. And that's why I think it's a fun thing to experiment with. It's like choosing a film. Back in the days of film, the manufacturers had a distinct style for each of their model of film. And so when you were looking at a picture, you could say, oh, that's with Portra 160 or Velvia 50 or whatever, because the colors, the tones, the richness of the image would be determined by the film. And it's the same when shooting in JPEG. By having your picture setting and white balance done in camera, you can develop a style that's quite distinctive, and you can use that JPEG to then inform your editing choices later on with a RAW file. You can use that to just experiment with creating your own style, and it's just, as I say, it's just a bit of an experimentation to try and improve your photography by understanding how contrast, saturation, picture tone, sharpness, all of these different factors affect your images in camera. What you could do is, if you're worried about only having a JPEG, is to shoot in both RAW and JPEG and then use that JPEG to determine how you edit your images. If you were shooting in any professional context, then shoot in RAW as a backup, whatever you do. But I'm just suggesting that the key to improving photography is experimentation, and one experiment that you can try is shooting in JPEG only for a time or on a particular project. Let's move on to Tip number two. Tip number two is to learn to read your histogram. I must admit I was a bit late to the mark on this one. I spent years not fully understanding what that meant, and I didn't even know that you can see the histogram on your camera when you're taking a picture. And that is a vital skill that you should really understand. Because I didn't understand my histogram and I wasn't paying attention to it, I created a lot of underexposed images, a lot darker than they needed to be. And now that I've got my histogram up on my camera, I can see when I'm going too dark with an image, and I can create something a bit brighter without blowing my highlights. So the histogram is a graph. It shows darkness to brightness, essentially. I'm really simplifying here, but this is your blacks, shadows, midtones, whites, and then highlights are right at the edge. The biggest fear any photographer has is hitting that right-hand side of the graph, really coming up to the edge, because you're going to blow your highlights. And that means you're going to lose detail in those highlights, and it's just going to appear like a white splodge in the middle of your frame, and it looks horrible, and it really detracts from the view that you are trying to take a picture of. The other thing is that there's a piece of advice that's always floating around, which is exposed to the right, and that's basically that you want to be exposing those highlights, but not so far that you have blowout, but just enough that you have the detail there, but you also have a bright overall image. Otherwise, you end up getting a very dark image, which is what I was struggling with before. So learning to read your histogram and being able to do that in the field will drastically improve your photography in the field, and subsequently when you're editing, you can also see a histogram in Lightroom. That is really useful to know. Moving on to tip number 3, understand your depth of field. Now this is quite a complicated subject, and for years I really did not understand it. This was something that my friends tried to explain to me multiple times, and I just nodded along, not understanding a word. So the way that I think of it is, depth of field is the wrong name. It should be depth of focus. That helped me understand it, because if we have an object in our plane like this mouse, and we are focusing on this object in our frame, in our landscape, your depth of field is how far in front of the object and how far behind the object remains in focus. And that's why it's important to understand. If you have your aperture wide open at f2.8 or f4, that has a very shallow depth of field, which means that the distance that is in focus is very small, and that's how you get a lovely blurred background when shooting wildlife or macro. But when shooting landscape, you really don't want a blurred image. You want to try and get as much in focus as possible, because it sets the scene better. All lenses have a sweet spot, an aperture that is just right for getting the maximum depth of field. If you are very wide open, it's a very shallow depth of field. And if you go fully closed at f22, you end up distorting the frame, because the light ends up bending through the aperture. And so all lenses have an aperture that is best for your depth of field, and typically that's in the region of f11 to f16, but it will depend on your lens. So you need to understand how depth of field affects your imagery, because you can use it to your advantage. You can use it to create a more interesting picture. You can know when you want to use that shallow depth of field, when you want a lot of the image to be blurred and only one select thing to be in focus, such as in macro photography, or in some cases in landscape photography. You might want to blur the background because you want your subject to stand out in the frame. At other times, you need to understand how far your depth of field is at that sweet spot, because let's say you're doing a very wide angle image of a landscape and you have a boulder sitting right close to you in the foreground. Now, it doesn't matter how good your camera is, it will not be able to focus on both the boulder and the distant objects. It's just impossible due to optics. So you can choose to take two images, one focused on the boulder, one focused on the landscape, and blend them together in Photoshop to create a focus stacked image. So it's really important to understand how much of your landscape is in focus and when you might need to create something a bit more interesting or different. So depth of field is something that is really useful to know. This next tip, I must admit I'm a little embarrassed to share with you because for years I didn't do this and it really did affect my photography. I read it in magazines, but I wasn't really invested in the editing process, and this has to do with the editing of your images. So tip number 4 is to check your images at 100% when editing. Zoom in, examine the details, because I have screwed up in the past, I must admit. So as I said, for years, I never zoomed in on my images when editing. I would just choose the one that I liked the look of best, play with the settings to get them the way that I wanted it to look, and then that was it, image done. However, that was a massive rookie mistake because more than once, multiple times, I edited images that were out of focus. And if I looked at the image next to it, I could see that that one was in focus. And if I had zoomed in, I could have seen which one was out of focus, which one was in focus, and chosen the right one to edit, but I didn't. The other thing that I didn't notice was the amount of dust that can appear in images. There's all these little dust bunnies all over an image that can be on your sensor, on your lenses, and I was just oblivious to that because I'd never zoomed in images that closely into that much detail. And that was a big mistake on my behalf. So this is a really useful tip. If you don't do it, try it, because you'll instantly see where you're making mistakes. You'll see when you needed to have had a bit more depth of field as well. And so it's sort of related to tip number 3, because with checking your images at 100%, you're able to check your depth of field and figure out what is good and what isn't. My tip number 5 is a little bit cliched, but I think it's important to say, is to practice, analyze and criticize your images and others. Through practicing, through being patient, through trying to learn where you're making mistakes, you will quickly improve your images. Take the time to analyze your images. Understand why an image isn't working or where you have gone wrong. Just by asking yourself those simple questions can really help you improve your photography. Look at images by photographers that you admire and analyze them as well. Try to understand why you like that image. Is it the composition? Is it the light? Is it the way that they have everything in focus? Going back to focus stacking, and ask yourselves, really try and examine why you like that image, and then try and apply that to your photography the next time you're out. You will soon realize that you can improve your photography quite quickly by learning from what you like. Photography is like any skill. It just requires practice. But at a certain point, you need to ask yourself, how do I get to the next stage? How do I keep improving what I'm already doing? And that comes through self-criticism, to say like, okay, I screwed up in that image because. Understand where you screwed up. Really try and figure that out. And if need be, ask for advice. Go to photography clubs, contact other photographers that you know, and just ask for tips on how you could improve or what you've done wrong. Now, don't take it personally if they say like, oh, you did this wrong, you did this wrong, or you did that wrong, because they're just trying to help you improve. Equally, that person should encourage you to tell you what you've done right, because without that positivity, without some detail or something that you have done correctly, it can feel very disheartening to constantly hear what you've done wrong. A good teacher helps to build you up. They help to teach you what you've done right as well as what you've done wrong, and try and encourage you to try to improve next time. To be honest, I learned most of what I do from practice. I would read about it, I would talk to my friends about it, and I would just go out and try it. And through that constant practice, constant trying new things, I've eventually improved my photography. But it took a long time, and it took a lot of self-criticism to get from a point where I was making a bad image to a point where I was making an image that is quite good. Don't get discouraged and just keep practicing. Like last week, like the week before, in my video about photography block, the only way that you're going to get through that photography block and the only way that you'll ever improve in photography is to pick up the camera and take a picture. Just as the only way to improve in drawing or writing is to pick up the pen or pencil and go at it. Let me know your thoughts on these 5 tips. I know that this is, as I said, this is a bit cliched, but I think it went quite well. You know, I'm trying to keep it real. Keep it real sounds like a fake thing to say. I'm just trying to be authentic and give you tips that I wish I had years ago. I don't want to make it out like these tips will make you instantly a better photographer, because the only way you're going to improve photography is through practice. So I want these tips to inspire you to go out and try. Try. Please do. That's the purpose of my channel. It's to inspire you to go out and do photography. And normally that would be through my in the field videos, but at the moment I'm not. I'm a bit stuck on those, as everyone is. I've got a lot of ideas for this sort of 5 tips video that I might come into later on, but we'll see how I develop my ideas, because each time I come to make a video it's a bit different and I'm coming up with something new. I'm going to end it now. If you've enjoyed today, don't forget to give it a thumbs up if you've enjoyed this video. If you find those 5 tips useful, or you think I have made a horrible mistake, please feel free to comment below. And if you want to see what's coming up on this channel in the future, with my ambition to inspire you to go out and do photography, then why not hit that subscribe button, and I will do my best to try and keep you motivated and get you out. As always, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.